My wife told me she was holding my 101-year-old father's hand as he lay dying in the emergency room. I believed her completely until I heard a sound. It was the smooth, elegant chime of a luxury hotel elevator. At Hartford Memorial Hospital, the elevators were heavy, clanking industrial machines from 1964 that only made a dull, mechanical clink-clank noise when they reached a floor. I knew right then that something was terribly wrong. Welcome back to Whispered Truths. I'm Tristan Vane. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 in the section below, so we can keep our family of listeners growing, and make sure to hit that subscribe button. You are going to absolutely enjoy the sheer precision of this one. I make my living as a senior systems engineer. My entire job revolves around finding the tiny hidden inconsistencies in thousands of lines of computer code. I trace bugs, fix structural errors, and ensure that every digital pathway runs on the correct intended path. In my world, a single misplaced semicolon or a mismatched data point can bring a multi-million-dollar banking system crashing to its knees. I never imagined that I would have to use those exact same forensic skills to debug my own marriage. But when a single discordant sound wave doesn't match the reality of a situation, the entire architecture of trust can collapse in a fraction of a second. That night, a severe nor'easter blizzard was raging across the coast of Massachusetts. My heavy-duty truck fought through the swirling whiteout as the highway became engulfed in thick drifts of snow. The dashboard clock read exactly 2 in the morning. The cabin of my car was silent except for the low, rhythmic hum of the heater when my phone suddenly vibrated on the console. The screen lit up with the name of my wife, Clarissa. When I answered, her voice came through the speaker choked with heavy, dramatic emotion. She was sobbing hysterically. She told me that my father, Barnaby, had just suffered a catastrophic coronary arrest at his home. She said she was currently at Hartford Memorial Hospital's emergency room, sitting on a hard plastic chair beside his bed. She told me she was clutching his frail, cold hand tightly, weeping as she watched his chest struggle to rise. My heart tightened into a hard, painful knot. Barnaby was a retired federal appellate judge. He was 101 years old, a proud, stoic man who had raised me alone after my mother's passing, and he was the absolute anchor of my life. I immediately pressed my foot hard against the accelerator, forcing the heavy truck to plow through the blinding snow, desperate to reach him before his time ran out. I trusted Clarissa without a single shadow of a doubt. For the 7 years of our marriage, she had been the picture of the perfect, supportive partner. A woman who dedicated her days to managing the Vane Legacy Foundation, a major charitable organization my father had established. She was widely known in high society circles for her warmth, her philanthropy, and her gentle, loving nature. But then, a catastrophic system error occurred over the cellular network, as Clarissa was sobbing, describing the pale, lifeless color of my father's face. She took a brief, sharp breath. In that tiny moment of silence, a sound slipped through the microtransmitter of her phone. It was a soft, elegant electronic harp chime, followed by a polite, synthesized male voice that announced with perfect mechanical clarity, "Sixth floor penthouse suites." It was the unmistakable sound of a modern, state-of-the-art Schindler elevator, the kind of high-end equipment found only in five-star boutique hotels. I froze. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned paper white. My engineering mind, trained to analyze data and detect anomalies, instantly went to work. Hartford Memorial Hospital was an old, sprawling brick structure built in the middle of the last century. I had visited my father's office and old friends there hundreds of times. The hospital's elevators were ancient, rusted steel shafts that groaned with aging pulleys and shook violently between floors. They only made a loud physical clanging noise when the heavy doors slid open, and they certainly never spoke with a polished, digital, high society voice. Clarissa was lying to me. She was not sitting in a cold, sterile emergency room, holding the hand of my dying father. She was inside a luxury hotel, riding a high-speed elevator to a penthouse suite. But I did not scream. I did not slam on the brakes. and I did not demand to know where she was. A good systems engineer never reaches a final conclusion before gathering a comprehensive, irrefutable dataset. If you confront a bug too early, the malicious code simply hides itself deeper in the operating system. You must let the program run its course so you can map every single corrupted pathway. I kept my voice perfectly flat, infusing it with a manufactured tone of panic and grief. I told her to stay exactly where she was, to keep holding my father's hand, and promised her that I was racing toward the hospital as fast as the blizzard would allow. When I ended the call, the air inside the truck felt colder than the freezing storm outside. A deep, irreparable crack had officially fractured the foundation of my marriage. A 7-year partnership had suddenly become a corrupt file filled with missing blocks, gaps, and terrifying contradictions, and I was going to scan the entire past of our lives until I uncovered every single line of that betrayal. I pulled into the parking lot of Hartford Memorial Hospital at exactly 2:40 in the morning. The wind howled through the bare trees, throwing ice and snow against my face as I stepped out of the cabin. But the freezing weather outside was nothing compared to the absolute, unyielding ice forming in my chest. I ran through the sliding glass doors of the emergency entrance, my boots squeaking loudly on the clean tile floor, and headed straight for room 412. My father was there. He lay motionless on the narrow hospital gurney, his face pale and sunken beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. An oxygen mask covered his mouth and nose, fogging slightly with each shallow, uneven breath. Around his bed, the only sounds were the rhythmic, metallic beeps of the heart monitor and the soft hiss of the oxygen machine. Clarissa was nowhere to be found. The chair beside his bed was completely empty. There was no devoted, grieving daughter-in-law sitting in the darkness, no wet tissues on the table, and no trace of her presence whatsoever. I stood in the silence of room 412, staring down at my father's frail form, a cold, focused anger beginning to smolder deep in my bones. I walked out of the room and approached the central nurse's station. The night shift nurse, a tired-looking woman named Nurse Rayner, looked up from her computer screen as I approached. I introduced myself and asked about my father's condition, demanding to know who had brought him in. Nurse. Nurse Rayner checked her intake notes, shook her head, and looked at me with a soft, sympathetic expression. She explained that my father had been found unconscious at his home by a neighbor, who had called an ambulance. He had been transported to the hospital alone. No family members had accompanied him in the ambulance, and no one had signed the necessary emergency medical authorization forms. I pulled out my phone, pulled up a recent photograph of Clarissa, and showed it to her. I asked Nurse Rayner if this woman had been to the hospital tonight. Nurse Rayner studied the image for a moment, her eyes suddenly widening as she remembered. She confirmed that the woman in the photograph had indeed arrived at the emergency department about 40 minutes ago. She had claimed to be the patient's daughter-in-law, and had demanded to see him immediately. I asked if she had stayed with him. Nurse Rayner shook her head again. She told me that the woman had spent only a few minutes in the room before leaving. To verify, she kindly turned her monitor toward me and pulled up the hospital's security camera log. The timestamp that appeared on the security footage made my blood run cold. Clarissa had been in room 412 for exactly 6 minutes and 14 seconds. The security system had captured a complete objective behavioral log of her visit. The camera footage showed Clarissa entering the room wearing an expensive, tailored cashmere coat. She did not approach the bed to check my father's pulse. She did not look at the oxygen monitor or ask the medical staff about his prognosis. Instead, she stood near the window, pulled out her brand-new iPhone, and spent a minute adjusting her hair and coat in the reflection of the glass. Then, she stepped right beside my unconscious father's bed, leaned over his frail body, raised her phone, and took a selfie. On the screen of the security monitor, I watched her force her face into an expression of agonizing, tearful grief for the camera lens. The moment she captured the shot, her face instantly returned to a cold, neutral mask. She turned on her heel, slipped her phone back into her designer handbag, and walked out of the room. The entire visit had lasted 6 minutes and 14 seconds. To my wife, my dying father was not a human being who had welcomed her into his family with open arms. He was not a grandfather or a respected judge. He was merely a prop, a perfect, silent background element for a calculated social media post designed to build her public image as a devoted, self-sacrificing daughter-in-law. But this was not an impulsive act of vanity. My engineering mind immediately saw the broader structure. This was a carefully programmed alibi. She needed that photograph to prove she was at the hospital at 2:00 a.m., creating a foolproof cover story for the much darker reality of what she was doing inside that luxury hotel penthouse elevator. Standing in the cold hospital hallway, watching the security footage play over and over on the monitor, I felt a terrifying sensation wash over me. It was the realization that the woman I had shared a bed with for 7 years, the woman I had trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities, was a complete stranger. She was a hollow shell, a sociopath masquerading as a saint. But she had made one critical, fatal error. She had forgotten that she was married to a systems engineer. I did not run on blind emotion or trusting sentimentality. I ran on verified data, cross-referenced logs, and cold, unyielding facts. I returned to my truck and drove back to our empty house. The blizzard was still screaming, but my mind was operating with the silent, clinical efficiency of a high-powered processor. I walked into my home office, clicked my computer to life, and began my investigation. If my marriage was a piece of software infected with a silent, destructive virus, I was going to trace every single line of that malicious code back to its original source. I began by extracting the logs of my own professional travel schedule over the past 18 months. I had been required to fly out of town frequently to inspect and upgrade the mainframe servers for several national banks. I entered the exact dates and times of those business trips into a spreadsheet. Then, I cross-referenced that dataset with Clarissa's personal calendar and the official meeting schedule of the Vane Legacy Foundation. Whenever Clarissa went to a late-night charity board meeting or a philanthropic emergency conference, I pulled up the corresponding timestamps. When I applied a correlation function to the data, a chilling, absolute pattern emerged. Out of the 17 times I had traveled out of state for work, over the past year, Clarissa had reported an unexpected, late-night charity emergency exactly 17 times. The correlation was 100%. There was not a single deviation, not a single outlier. In my profession, a perfect 100% match across independent variables is never a coincidence. It is the signature of a highly structured, deliberately programmed system. I pushed deeper into the financial archives. I opened our joint credit card statements and began analyzing the transactions. Sure enough, charges from an ultra-exclusive boutique establishment in downtown Boston, the Gilded Crest, began appearing on the screen. The charges were for champagne, fine dining, and penthouse room service, and every single transaction had been processed on the exact nights I was away, using my own hard-earned money to fund her private betrayals. But that was not the biggest flaw in her architecture of lies. Clarissa was incredibly clever and highly meticulous in her daily life. She always deleted her text messages, cleared her call logs, and wiped her browser history before she came home. She believed that by keeping her personal iPhone completely clean, she was entirely invisible. But like many people who do not understand the underlying architecture of modern technology, she had absolutely no concept of backup systems and metadata synchronization. 3 years ago, I had set up an old, aluminum body MacBook Air for her to use in our home storage room for organizing old family photos. That computer was still silently connected to her shared Apple iCloud account. Even though she deleted the messages from her handheld device, the network architecture of the cloud continued to sync and back up every single transmission to the local hard drive of that old laptop in real time. I walked down the creaking wooden stairs into our cold, dark basement storage room. I pushed aside several boxes of old holiday decorations, located the silver laptop resting on a metal shelf, and brushed a thick layer of gray dust off its cover. I plugged in the power cable, opened the lid, and booted up the operating system. As the desktop appeared, The system automatically connected to our home Wi-Fi network. Instantly, the synchronization protocol began executing. Hundreds of messages, media files, and system logs began downloading to the local drive in real time. The blue glow of the screen illuminated my face in the dark basement, reflecting off my eyes as line after line of digital evidence poured onto the display. It was a complete, uncensored diary of moral decay. The person my wife had been communicating with was saved under a single simple initial, C. I began reading the most recent messages, scrolling backward through time. At first, the texts were filled with standard, illicit romance, cliches about secret meetings and mutual desire. But as I scrolled deeper into the database, the tone of the conversations shifted from romantic betrayal into something far more cold-blooded. This was not merely an mere affair of passion. It was a highly organized, systematic financial conspiracy. The man behind that initial was Cassian Blackstone, a senior trustee of the Vane Legacy Foundation, whom my father had trusted implicitly for over 15 years. The messages between Clarissa and Cassian Blackstone exposed a plan of monstrous cruelty. They did not speak of love. They spoke of asset allocation, document forgery, and my father's impending demise. I stared at the screen as a message from Cassian Blackstone, sent just 24 hours earlier, flashed before my eyes. How much longer can the old man hold on? The asset transfer paperwork has to be completed and signed before he closes his eyes. If he dies before the Vane legacy accounts are migrated, the probate court will freeze everything. Clarissa's reply was written with a coldness that made my skin crawl. Don't worry. I already stopped by the hospital and took the photo to establish my alibi. My idiot husband is currently racing over there, completely panicked. Everything is going according to plan. Once the old man is gone, the $8.6 million in the Foundation's core accounts will be legally routed to our offshore holding entity, and there won't be a single thing Tristan can do about it. I sat in the silence of that dusty storage room, my fists clenching until my knuckles cracked. A hot wave of raw, violent rage surged through my chest, making it difficult to draw air. The woman I had protected, the woman my father had loved and treated like his own daughter, was sitting in a luxury suite with her lover, actively celebrating my father's heart attack and plotting to steal the $8. $6 million he had spent 50 years building to fund medical treatment for impoverished children. They had calculated my grief. They had laughed at my trust. They had turned my loyalty into the very tool they needed to execute their heist. But I did not let the anger consume my clarity. In a failing system, screaming at the screen does not fix the code. You must isolate the corrupted sectors and prepare the deletion protocol. I inserted a secure USB drive into the laptop, copied the entire iCloud backup database, the complete message logs, the metadata timestamps, and the financial transaction files. This would be the diagnostic data I would use to dismantle their lives, with surgical, unyielding precision. At 5 in the morning, I drove back to Hartford Memorial Hospital. The storm was still whipping through the coastal trees, lashing the exterior of the hospital with frozen rain and heavy, wet snow. I could not allow my father to lie in that cold, sterile room surrounded by metaphorical predators, completely alone in his final hours. As I walked down the quiet, dimly lit fourth-floor hallway toward room 412, the only sound was the soft, squeaking squeal of my boots on the polished linoleum. As I neared the door of my father's room, my engineering instincts, always scanning for anomalies, always searching for variables that did not belong in the standard operating environment, immediately flagged another serious inconsistency. A stranger was sitting on one of the blue plastic chairs directly outside my father's room. He was a middle-aged man with a slightly slouched posture, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that looked like it had been purchased off the rack at a discount outlet. A half-empty paper coffee cup rested in his hand, and his eyes darted nervously up and down the hallway with an intense, erratic energy. At this hour of the morning, the hospital corridors were completely deserted. The shift change hadn't happened yet, and the silence was thick, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. His presence stood out like a foreign, unrecognized line of code, executing inside a secured system memory. It was an intrusion, an uninvited block of data that disrupted the entire diagnostic flow. I approached quietly, stepping carefully, my heavy boots making no sound on the thin linoleum floor. I stepped up directly behind him, glancing over his shoulder. He was staring intently at his phone screen, completely unaware of my presence. On the display, I saw a text message thread from an unsaved number. The message was brief, demanding, and chillingly familiar. Has Tristan arrived yet? Just keep acting. I recognized that phone number instantly. It belonged to my wife, Clarissa. My entire body went rigid with a sudden, freezing wave of realization. Clarissa had not only abandoned my dying father and lied about her location, she had actually planted a watchman outside his hospital door to monitor my movements and manage the narrative. She had turned the corridor of an emergency ward into a controlled theater, and this man was her leading actor. I stepped forward and placed a cold, heavy hand on the man's shoulder. He jumped violently, his body giving a desperate jerk of panic, nearly spilling his lukewarm coffee on his cheap trousers. His head snapped upward, his eyes wide with a mixture of raw fear and absolute confusion, under the harsh fluorescent lights. "How much is Clarissa paying you to sit here?" I asked. My voice a low, freezing whisper that cut through the silence of the hallway like a surgical scalpel. The man's lips parted, but his vocal cords seemed to completely seize up under my gaze. He made a sudden, panicky movement, trying to stand up and push past me to run toward the exit of the ward. But I didn't waste a single motion. I stepped directly into his path, my hand turning into an iron grip on his shoulder, and shoved him firmly back down into the hard plastic chair. The absolute, unyielding pressure of my hand made it clear that he had nowhere to go, that his escape route had been completely blocked by a superior system force. I leaned in close, staring directly into his shifting, bloodshot eyes. "I am going to ask you one more time, and your answer will determine whether you leave this building, in the back of a police cruiser, or on your own 2 feet. How much is Clarissa paying you to sit here?" He swallowed hard, his face turning an ashen, sickly shade of green beneath the fluorescent lights. His hands trembled, setting the paper coffee cup down on the floor as he gestured in total surrender. He began to stammer, his words tumbling out of him in a desperate rush to escape my grip. He confessed that his name was Felix Mercer, and that he was merely an unemployed freelance actor, struggling to pay his rising rent in Boston. He had responded to a private casting call posted on a freelance recruiting website. Felix Mercer admitted that my wife was paying him exactly $350 a day, in cash. His assignment was as simple as it was disgusting. He was instructed to wear a professional suit, sit outside room 412, and remain there throughout the 24-hour cycle. Whenever the hospital doctors, the specialists, or the nursing staff walked out of my father's room, Felix was supposed to stand up immediately, run his fingers through his hair to look exhausted, pretend to be a deeply concerned, grieving family member, and ask emotional, high-minded questions about my father's condition and treatment options. Clarissa had literally purchased an artificial simulation of family devotion. She had hired a cheap actor to perform the role of a loving, grieving relative, ensuring that the hospital staff would believe the Vane family was constantly monitoring the elderly judge's care with broken hearts. It was a cold, calculated masterpiece of behavioral programming, designed to keep the hospital from suspecting her absence, and more importantly, to keep her image pristine while she was wrapped in the arms of Cassian Blackstone at their luxury penthouse suite. It was the ultimate performance of a loving family, bought and paid for with a cash transaction. I felt a deep, sickening wave of revulsion rise in my throat, threatening to choke me. I demanded his phone. Trembling with fear, Felix unlocked the device and handed it over without a single protest. I used my own phone to photograph the entire message history, the cash payment agreements, the address coordinates of their meetings, and the call logs between him and Clarissa. "Your performance has just been cancelled, Felix," I said, handing his phone back to him with a slow, deliberate movement. "Pack up your things, take your cheap suit, and get out of this hospital immediately. If I see your face in this building or anywhere near my father again, I will personally have the police arrest you for conspiracy." fraud, and elder exploitation. Do you understand me? The paid actor didn't say another word. He grabbed his worn leather bag, scrambled out of the chair, and fled down the emergency stairwell as fast as his legs could carry him, his frantic footsteps echoing in the quiet shaft like a retreating drumbeat. I walked into room 412, shutting the door behind me. I sat down in the empty chair beside the gurney, taking hold of my father's thin, weathered hand. His skin was paper thin, covered with dark bruises from the IV lines. Staring at his peaceful, unconscious face, I knew that my defensive phase was officially over. It was time to execute a complete system purge, to clean the entire mainframe of my life, of the parasites that had infected it. I left my father's bedside briefly to walk back to the central nurse's station to sign the official medical intake and emergency authorization forms that Clarissa had intentionally neglected during her brief 6-minute visit. The hospital corridors were cold, smelling of antiseptic and old floor wax, a grim reminder of the physical fragility of life. While I was filling out the forms, I overheard a sound of quiet, desperate sobbing coming from the small consultation room across the hall. I glanced through the open glass door and saw a middle-aged woman sitting alone in the dim light, clutching a thick stack of medical records to her chest as if they were a life preserver. Her face was hollow, lined with deep creases of exhaustion and a deep, agonizing despair that no parent should ever have to bear. Her name was Evelyn Pendleton. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to step inside. Perhaps it was the shared grief of the hospital ward, or perhaps it was my analytical mind sensing another hidden node of trauma that was somehow connected to my own. I introduced myself, offering a quiet, respectful word of comfort. When Evelyn looked up, her tear-filled eyes locked onto my name tag, staring at the letters of my last name. She began to cry even harder, and with trembling, uncertain fingers, she opened her manila folder and pulled out a legal settlement document. As my eyes fell upon the heading of that document, my entire world suffered another violent, catastrophic shock. Printed at the top of the page was the official, embossed gold seal of the Vane Legacy Foundation, the charity my father had spent his lifetime building and protecting. And signed in bold, elegant ink at the bottom of the page was the signature of my wife, Clarissa Vane, President. Evelyn explained through her broken, ragged tears that her 14-year-old daughter, Chloe Pendleton, had been admitted to the hospital's pediatric psychiatric emergency unit earlier that very night. Chloe had been subjected to such vicious, systematic cyberbullying, online harassment, and physical intimidation at her elite private academy that she had fallen into a deep, clinical depression, eventually refusing to eat and attempting to end her own life. I asked Evelyn why my father's charitable foundation was involved in this school crisis, why their names were on a settlement document. Her answer completely shattered whatever remaining fragments of humanity I thought my wife possessed. Clarissa's moral corruption was far more grotesque, far more deeply entrenched than a simple extramarital affair, or a standard corporate embezzlement scheme. Evelyn showed me a comprehensive, non-disclosure confidentiality agreement. The Vane Legacy Foundation had recently received a massive restricted endowment worth exactly $1.6 million from a billionaire real estate developer named Sutton Vance. Sutton Vance was the father of the wealthy, popular girl who had organized, funded, and led the group of teenagers responsible for torturing young Chloe. The $1.6 million was not a charitable donation. It was hush money, pure and simple, laundered through the Foundation's pristine books. Clarissa had used the massive social prestige, the legal weight, and the aggressive lawyers of the Vane Legacy Foundation to systematically pressure, intimidate, and threaten Evelyn's family. She had forced them to sign a sweeping, non-disclosure withdrawal agreement, burying the entire bullying scandal and preventing it from reaching the local press or the ears of the police, all to protect the clean, pristine image of a major high society charity gala scheduled for the following week, which Sutton Vance's corporation was sponsoring. To Clarissa, the future and mental survival of a shattered 14-year-old girl fighting for her life in the psychiatric unit meant absolutely nothing compared to the glossy, high society aesthetic of her upcoming black tie fundraising event. She had literally sold out a traumatized child for $1.6 million in corporate sponsorship, using my father's sacred charity as a shield for a billionaire's spoiled, abusive daughter. My hands shook with a terrible white-hot fury as I held the agreement, the edges of the paper crumpling under the pressure of my grip. At that exact millisecond, my phone vibrated violently in my pocket. It was an automated security alert from the proprietary home network system I had built inside my father's residence and office. The alert was critical, flashing in bright red text. Unauthorized remote admin access detected. Clarissa had just remotely logged into my father's personal office mainframe computer. A high-priority, system-wide data destruction script had been executed. She was currently running a deep, remote wiping command across the core storage servers of the retired federal judge. My mind raced. Clarissa was in a desperate hurry to erase all of my father's legal files, backup wills, and digital assets before his heart stopped beating. She wanted to ensure there would be no surviving, competing draft of his estate plans, leaving a completely clear, uncontested path for her and Cassian Blackstone to seize the Foundation's $8.6 million. She wanted to erase his entire digital footprint while he lay unconscious. I said a hurried, solemn goodbye to Evelyn, promising her on the memory of my mother that I would find justice for Chloe. Then, I rushed out of the hospital and sprinted to my truck, my mind operating at a terrifying, hyper-focused capacity. The virus had invaded the core directory of my life, and it was my job to completely isolate it and prepare the terminal deletion command. I arrived home at 6:15 in the morning. The house was completely empty. Clarissa had still not returned from her night of betrayal at the luxury hotel in Boston with her lover. The silence of the empty rooms was deafening, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. I walked directly into my office and locked the heavy mahogany door. I closed the thick curtains, shutting out the gray morning light, and switched on the high-powered drafting lamp. I pulled a massive roll of drafting paper from my cabinet and taped it across the central wall of the office. I uncapped 3 markers, black, red, and blue. It was time to construct the comprehensive diagnostic blueprint of their destruction. This was my canvas of truth, a physical manifest of their betrayal. First, I used the black marker to plot the absolute, objective facts, the verified system data logs. I mapped the exact minute my father's heart monitor flagged his attack. I mapped the security camera log showing the 6 minutes and 14 seconds Clarissa spent taking her selfie. I recorded the confession of the paid actor, Felix Mercer, and the IP address of the remote connection used to initiate the data wipe. I drew thick, unyielding black lines that represented the structural foundation of the case. Data that could not be bent, broken, or disputed in any court of law. Next, I used the red marker to map Clarissa's lies, the fabricated board meetings, the fake calendar entries, and the desperate sobbing phone call she had made to me during the snowstorm. The red ink crisscrossed the paper like a bleeding network of deception, a map of her absolute vanity and hollow heart. Finally, I used the blue marker to trace the flow of money. I connected our joint credit card statements from the Gilded Crest Hotel to Cassian Blackstone's travel schedule. I mapped the path of the $1.6 million in hush money from Sutton Vance directly into a private undisclosed bank account held under Clarissa's name. As the lines of ink intersected, a horrifying, monstrous detail became clear on my wall. The remote data wipe command on my father's computer had been initiated exactly 24 minutes before the hospital, or the neighbors called for emergency services. The data didn't lie. Clarissa had been at my father's house when his heart attack occurred. She had watched the 101-year-old man collapse in agony. But instead of calling 911 immediately to save his life, her very first action had been to sit down at his desk, log into his mainframe, and execute the data destruction script. She had deliberately delayed seeking medical help, actively waiting and hoping for him to die in his study so that she could secure her control over the $8.6 million before anyone could intervene. She had sat there, calmly typing on the keyboard, while my father took what she hoped was his final breath. It was not just an affair, and it was not just a white-collar theft. It was a cold-blooded, systematic murder attempt through calculated negligence. My blood boiled, but my mind remained ice-cold. I compiled every shred of evidence, the iCloud database, the actor's statement, the metadata analysis, and the $1.6 million confidentiality agreement, onto a secure, encrypted hard drive. I was not going to hand this file over to the police in silence. I was going to destroy her in the very place where she believed she was absolute queen. I picked up my phone and made a call to Cassian Blackstone. When he answered, his voice carried the sleepy, arrogant tone of a wealthy man who believed he was untouchable. He was probably still lying in his warm bed, completely satisfied with his scheme. I did not offer a greeting. I simply began reading aloud the exact metadata of his private messages from the iCloud backup. I read out the hidden routing numbers of the offshore account he had used to receive embezzled funds from the Vane Legacy Foundation. I read the IP addresses of his logins and the dates of his hotel stays with my wife. A suffocating, terrified silence fell over the line. I could hear his shallow, rapid breathing through the speaker, the sound of a predator suddenly realizing he had become the prey. I gave him a simple, clinical ultimatum. Either he would show up at the special board meeting on the eve of the charity gala and deliver a full confession against Clarissa, or I would transmit the entire forensic file to the Internal Revenue Service and the federal prosecutor's office by 9:00 a.m. Cassian was a seasoned financial predator. He understood the mathematical probability of risk and survival. He knew that if he fought, he would face 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He instantly chose to save his own skin, agreeing to betray my wife. Next, I contacted Savannah Sinclair, the lead coordinator of the upcoming charity gala. I sent her Natalie's psychiatric records and the $1.6 million hush money agreement bearing Clarissa's signature. Savannah was a woman of profound moral integrity. When she saw how the foundation had been used to cover up the abuse of a 14-year-old girl, she broke down in tears and agreed to help me set the perfect trap. 2 days later, the special board meeting took place on the eve of the grand gala. Clarissa entered the executive boardroom, wearing a stunning, tailored white designer suit, her face radiant with confidence. She believed her alibi was perfect, her husband was clueless, and the $8.6 million was within her grasp. She sat in the chairperson's seat and greeted the trustees with a radiant, high society smile. At exactly 10 a.m., I pushed open the heavy oak doors and walked in. Clarissa's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "Tristan, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice dipping with artificial warmth. "Your father is still in the hospital. You should be beside his bed." I did not say a word. I walked to the head of the conference table, plugged my encrypted hard drive into the main projection system, and clicked the remote. The massive wall screen lit up, but it did not display the Foundation's annual financial reports. It displayed my three-color diagnostic diagram. The entire boardroom stared in stunned, horrified silence as the security video of Clarissa taking her selfie beside my dying father played on a loop. The recorded video statement of the hired actor, Felix Mercer, echoed through the high-fidelity speakers. The $1.6 million hush money agreement bearing her signature appeared in massive, high-definition text. Clarissa leaped to her feet, her face turning an ashen, ghost-like white. "This is a fabrication. My husband is mentally unstable," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. But at that exact moment, the rear door opened, and Cassian Blackstone walked in. He did not look at her. He walked straight to the table and handed a physical folder of the Foundation's original, unaltered financial ledgers to the board members. Savannah Sinclair stood up, her voice ringing with absolute authority. She announced that the Vane Legacy Foundation's sponsorship agreement with Sutton Vance's firm had been terminated, and that Clarissa's presidency and administrative authority had been officially revoked. The board erupted into a chaotic storm of outrage. Clarissa collapsed back into her leather chair, her expensive clothes and high society prestige completely useless. Her carefully constructed system had suffered a fatal, irreversible crash. If you have followed the story this far, then it has probably given you some strong emotions. Please do us a quick favor. Like and subscribe, and leave a comment with the number 5 in the section below, so we can keep sharing these hard-earned lessons. Many people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing, and means a great deal to us. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room, leaving Clarissa sitting in the cold silence of her absolute public humiliation. But the debugging process was not yet complete. As I stepped into the lobby of the building, my phone vibrated. The screen displayed the incoming number of Hartford Memorial Hospital. On the other end of the line was the chief emergency physician. His voice was trembling with sheer, unadulterated astonishment as he delivered the news. My 101-year-old father, the retired federal judge, had miraculously regained full consciousness. It was a final, brilliant burst of clarity before his body surrendered to time. The mind of the former judge had suddenly become as razor-sharp as it had been during his decades on the bench. The physician told me that my father had requested to see both Clarissa and me immediately. I returned to the conference room. Clarissa was still sitting there, frozen in a daze of defeat. I looked down at her and spoke with a quiet, unyielding coldness. My father is awake, and he wants to see us right now. At the word awake, a look of absolute, primitive terror flashed in her eyes. She knew exactly what digital crimes she had committed in his office before calling the ambulance. She understood that if his mind was clear, her entire world of lies would be shredded under the light of the law. But her desperate survival instinct left her no choice. She stood up and followed me to the hospital, frantically searching for some way to save herself. We entered room 412 at 11:30 a.m. My father was sitting upright against the headboard, his eyes bright and focused. It was as if the force of justice itself was granting him a final reservoir of strength. The moment we walked through the door, Clarissa rushed to his bedside. She threw herself onto her knees, forcing out loud, hysterical sobs, crying that she had been framed and begging him to believe her. She was desperately performing the role of the devoted, loving daughter-in-law once again. But my father did not look at her. He kept his cold, judicial gaze fixed on me. Then, he slowly raised his frail hand and pressed the play button on a small, heavy black recording device, resting on the tray beside his bed. It was a standalone, vintage mechanical tape recorder with no network connectivity. It was the one physical element Clarissa had completely overlooked when she initiated her remote digital wipe. The machine crackled softly, and then Clarissa's own voice filled the sterile room, speaking to Cassian Blackstone in my father's study on the night of his collapse. The old man has passed out. Let me delete the electronic will files first, then I'll call an ambulance. He's 101 years old anyway. If he dies now, that's perfectly reasonable. Clarissa's voice froze mid-sub. Her body went completely rigid as she stared at the turning reels of the tape. My father had suspected her greed months ago. He had secretly installed a hard-wired, mechanical recording system beneath the desk in his study. A closed-loop system that could not be hacked, bypassed, or remotely erased. My father turned his head slowly, looking down at the trembling woman kneeling beside him. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that carried the full weight of a lifetime of authority. "Clarissa," he said with absolute finality, "you are no longer my daughter." Standing in the corner of the room was our family attorney, Rebecca Voss, who had been waiting in silence. My father gestured for her to step forward. He signed an emergency ironclad amendment to his last will and testament right there in his hospital bed. The new will stated that his entire estate of $8.6 million, along with all family properties and holdings, would be transferred into a secure, irrevocable trust jointly managed by Evelyn Pendleton and me. The funds would be used exclusively to provide comprehensive medical treatment, therapy, and legal protection for Natalie and other young victims of school bullying. Clarissa was completely disinherited. Her share of the Vane legacy was officially reduced to zero. She let out a high-pitched scream of pure rage, lunging forward to tear the document from the attorney's hands. But at that exact second, the door to room 412 swung wide open. 2 hospital security officers and 3 uniformed police officers stepped into the room, holding an emergency arrest warrant approved directly by the federal prosecutor's office. The cold, steel handcuffs closed tightly around Clarissa's wrists. As they escorted her out of the room, my phone received another data notification. It was an automated email containing a massive, confidential file sent from Cassian Blackstone's personal server. As part of his plea bargain, Cassian had delivered the final, fatal nail in the coffin of Clarissa's defense. The files contained complete records of fraudulent federal tax filings connected to the Vane Legacy Foundation over the past 3 years. Clarissa had systematically laundered millions of dollars, turning the charity into a private tax shelter for billionaire developers like Sutton Vance. This was no longer a civil dispute over an inheritance. It was a major federal financial conspiracy. I watched as the police led Clarissa down the hospital corridor in handcuffs. The high society queen was gone. Only a panicked, humiliated fraud remained. The staff and visitors gathered in the hallway to watch her descent, taking photos that would soon cover the front pages of the morning news. Inside room 412, a profound, quiet peace settled over the space. My father looked at me, a soft, tired smile warming his face. The cold authority of the federal judge was gone, replaced by the pure, unconditional love of a father who had completed his final mission on earth. He had protected his son, and he had secured the justice he had dedicated his life to pursuing. 1 hour after Clarissa's arrest, my father closed his eyes for the last time. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, without a single moment of pain or regret. Just then, the door opened quietly, and Evelyn Pendleton entered the room, holding young Chloe's hand. Chloe still looked thin and fragile, but for the first time in months, there was a spark of life returning to her eyes. She walked over to me and handed me a small, colorful drawing she had made. It showed a clear, bright blue sky free of storm clouds. Looking at Chloe's smile, I knew that my father's $8.6 million had been placed exactly where it belonged. Justice is not merely about executing a clinical demolition of the guilty. It is about building a secure, unshakable sanctuary for the wounded. Clarissa was held without bail at the county jail. The federal government immediately froze and seized all of her personal bank accounts, luxury properties, and assets. Logan Pierce and Cassian Blackstone were arrested at the airport while attempting to board a private flight to the Bahamas. Sutton Vance's $1.6 million confidentiality agreement was officially declared null and void, and he was subpoenaed to face charges of bribery and conspiracy. A week after my father's funeral, I sat alone in the empty, silent boardroom of the Vane Legacy Foundation. The system had been completely cleaned. The malicious code of deception had been permanently erased. At that moment, the family attorney, Rebecca Voss, called me. She informed me of a shocking development. While federal agents were executing a search warrant on Clarissa's private penthouse suite at the Gilded Crest, they had discovered a hidden, fireproof safe concealed behind a large portrait of her. Inside the safe was a single, thick folder bearing my name. Harriet sent a backup PDF of the documents to my email. As the first page loaded onto my screen, my breath caught in my throat. The folder was titled, Planned Project to Approach Tristan Vane. The creation date on the metadata was June 18, 2020. Exactly 1 week before Clarissa had accidentally spilled hot coffee on my shirt at my favorite local cafe, sparking our initial romance. The past 7 years of my life had not been a coincidence of fate. They had been a pre-programmed, cold-blooded financial project. Clarissa had studied my habits, my psychological profile, my musical tastes, and my vulnerabilities. She knew I was a high-earning systems engineer, and she knew my father controlled a massive federal fortune. She had spent 7 years performing the role of a loving, supportive wife, solely to gain access to our legacy. But there was a darker, more terrifying secret buried at the bottom of that folder. I scrolled down to the final pages, which contained a forensic report from the year 2016. My mother's tragic death in a car accident 10 years ago had not been a random traffic misfortune. The documents prove that Cassian Blackstone and Clarissa had orchestrated a deliberate act of brake system sabotage on her vehicle to isolate my father and make him emotionally dependent on them. A cold, Absolute silence filled the boardroom. The depth of their malice exceeded anything I could have ever calculated. But they had forgotten the golden rule of systems engineering. Data never truly disappears. It simply waits for the person with the right diagnostic tools to recover it. I forwarded the complete forensic file directly to the federal prosecutor's office. Clarissa's 18-year sentence was officially upgraded to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Looking back on this grueling, painful journey, I want to leave you with 3 hard-earned lessons that cost me the lives of my parents to learn. Lesson 1. Never mistake a parent's patience, silence, and unconditional love for weakness that can be exploited. A parent's love is a powerful, protective force, but when that love is betrayed, it can transform into an unyielding wall of justice. Lesson 2. Never sign property documents or hand over financial authority simply because the person asking is family. Long tot không đi kèm sự khôn ngoan chính là lời mời gọi cho sự lợi dụng. Always run your life on verified facts and cross-referenced evidence, not on vague, blind emotions. Lesson 3. Forgiving someone and allowing them back into your life with control over your peace are 2 completely different things. You can find the spiritual strength to let go of your anger, but you must maintain a concrete, unyielding boundary to protect your sanctuary from being violated a second time. That night, my wife told me she was holding my father's hand in the ER. Months later, I realized that the worst deceptions often hide behind the most beautiful masks. I stepped out onto the balcony of the boardroom, looking out over the water as a warm summer breeze cleared away the suffocating air of the past. My home was finally clean. The system of my life had completed its debugging process, and I was finally ready to write new, beautiful lines of code for my own future. Thank you for joining Whispered Truths. Don't forget to share your own thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe so you won't miss the next hard-earned lesson. See you in the next story.